The ballroom smelled like money, aged whiskey, imported roses, and the particular confidence of people who had never once worried about a bill. Victoria Sterling moved through it like she owned the air itself. She stopped in front of the man near the entrance. Worn jacket, scuffed shoes, a face that had clearly seen harder rooms than this one. "I have to ask." She tilted her head, voice honeyed and perfectly audible. "Is the sad dad at a school play look intentional, or did the dry cleaner lose your real suit?" More laughter. Louder this time. The man said nothing. Just watched the room with those flat, unreadable eyes, like her words had landed somewhere he'd already decided not to feel. Victoria smiled and turned away. She had no idea what that silence was worth. She would find out before the night was over. The morning after the Malibu party, the Sterling Tech headquarters building caught the early Manhattan sun, the way Victoria liked everything to catch light. Sharp, deliberate, impossible to ignore. 42 floors of tinted glass and steel rising above Midtown, the kind of building that made people on the sidewalk below tilt their heads back and feel small. Victoria had designed that effect herself. She understood the architecture of power long before she understood anything else. She was 29 years old and had run Sterling Tech for 3 years. Her father had built the company from a 2-room office in Newark. She had turned it into the 7th largest technology conglomerate in the country. Nobody gave her that. She had taken it brick by brick with the same cold precision she applied to everything: board meetings, press conferences, contract negotiations, and as of 6 weeks ago, the anonymous letters that had started arriving at her private office address. The first one was easy to dismiss. The second made her attorney nervous. By the 5th, the NYPD's Corporate Threat Division was involved, and her head of security had started using the word escalating in a tone she didn't like. The letters were connected to the Hargrove acquisition, a merger worth $4.2 billion that Victoria had been quietly assembling for 8 months. Someone knew the details. Someone was angry enough to put that anger in writing. And someone, according to the surveillance footage pulled from the parking garage beneath Sterling Tower, had been watching her car for at least 3 weeks. Ethan Carter arrived on a Tuesday. He came recommended by the private security firm her attorney retained former Marine Corps 2 tours overseas, 4 years in private protection detail. His file was clean. His references were better than clean. Victoria barely read past the first page before her assistant scheduled the intake meeting. He walked into her office at 9 in the morning in a dark jacket that had been pressed but couldn't hide its age-dark trousers, and the kind of posture that took years of being told to hold it to become automatic. He was big without being obvious about it, the kind of build that registered as calm until something happened. Victoria imagined, and then registered, as something else entirely. "Mr. Carter." She didn't look up from her laptop immediately. "Sit." "I'll stand." His voice was even not rude, just a statement of preference. Victoria looked up then. He was scanning the office window's door, the second door behind her desk that led to the private elevator. His eyes moved the way a person's eyes moved when they were counting exits, not admiring the view. "The firm tells me you have a daughter," she said. "I do." 8 years old. "Yes." She folded her hands on the desk. "And you're doing this kind of work. Protection detail. Odd hours travel, high-risk environments." Ethan looked at her directly for the first time. "Is this part of the security intake, Ms. Sterling?" It wasn't. She knew it wasn't. She asked it anyway because she wanted to see what he would do with an unfair question. He held her gaze without filling the silence with excuses or explanations, which told her something, though she wasn't ready to decide what. "You start tomorrow," she said, and went back to her laptop. The contempt came easily after that, the way contempt always does when it has an audience. At a client dinner in Tribeca 3 days into the arrangement, Victoria made a comment about his truck, a 2011 Ford pickup that he parked 2 blocks from the restaurant, because as he explained in exactly 9 words, the valet line would compromise his sight line. She mentioned the truck to the woman seated beside her, a hedge fund manager named Patricia, whose laugh sounded like ice in a crystal glass. Something about how her new security arrangement came with its own vintage aesthetic. The table laughed. Ethan stood near the restaurant entrance and gave no indication he'd heard. Though Victoria was certain he had, it became a pattern. The worn shoes at the charity preview, the off-brand coffee he brought in a steel thermos, while she accepted a $12 espresso from the hotel concierge. Small things she could pick up and hold in front of other people, like proof of something, though she would have struggled to name exactly what. Ethan never reacted. He held doors and watched hallways and stood in the back of rooms, and when his phone buzzed at 7 each evening, he would step 6 feet away and speak quietly for about 4 minutes. Victoria knew without being told that it was his daughter on the other end. He always came back from those calls with something slightly different in his jaw, not soft exactly. Settled. She found it irritating in a way she couldn't fully articulate. What she didn't know, couldn't see from where she stood in her marble lobbies and glass boardrooms, was what Ethan was doing in the hours she wasn't watching him. He had found the listening device on the second day, a micro-transmitter pressed into the wheel well of her town car, thin as a coin, the kind of hardware that wasn't cheap and wasn't amateur. He'd photographed it, noted the frequency, and left it in place while he ran his own trace, cross-referencing the signal against known surveillance vendors, flagging the results to a contact at the FBI field office he'd worked with twice before on private protection cases. He said nothing to Victoria because he had nothing confirmed yet, and because telling a client about a threat before you understood its shape was how clients made panicked decisions that complicated everything. At a networking event in Midtown 2 weeks, and a man in a gray overcoat positioned himself close to Victoria near the bar, too close, angling in at the edge of her conversation with a timing that wasn't accidental. Ethan moved first, stepping between them, with the specific body language that said occupied space without raising a voice or a hand. The man pulled back and disappeared into the crowd. Victoria never noticed. She was by that point in the middle of telling a senior partner from a major consulting firm that her new bodyguard was the kind of man who looked like he learned to iron his shirts at a shelter. The senior partner laughed politely and glanced toward the entrance where Ethan stood watching the room with his flat, careful eyes. "He looks capable enough," the man offered. "He looks like he needs the work," Victoria replied, and finished her drink. 3 nights later, on the expressway back from a late dinner in Queens, a black SUV came up fast on the driver's side and pushed their town car across 2 lanes. The driver, a 30-year veteran named Harold, who had driven Victoria for 6 years without incident, managed to keep the car straight and pull to the shoulder without rolling. Victoria sat in the back with her hand pressed flat against the seat, listening to her own breathing, not quite ready to call it fear. Ethan was out of the passenger seat before the car fully stopped. He ran the perimeter of the vehicle, checked the undercarriage from distance, and got Victoria onto the floor of the back seat before she could tell him that she was fine and that this was unnecessary and that he was overreacting. "Stay down," he said. Not a suggestion. The black SUV was gone. No plates they could use. Harold was shaken, but unhurt. By the time the police arrived, Ethan had already photographed the scrape damage, measured the angle of impact, and filed a preliminary report with his FBI contact. Victoria sat on the guardrail in her $4,000 dress and looked at him working in the red and blue sweep of the squad car lights and felt something she immediately categorized as adrenaline and then immediately stopped thinking about. The call from her board came the next morning. The emergency session ran 90 minutes and ended with language that wasn't quite an ultimatum, but functioned as one the board required that Victoria travel with a full-time protection detail until the Hargrove deal closed. Constant coverage, no exceptions. The acquisition was too significant, the liability too large for them to accept anything less. There was also the matter of the Los Angeles component. 3 days of back-to-back meetings with Hargrove's legal team, their investment bankers, and a private signing ceremony that needed to happen in person and could not be rescheduled. The board's position was clear: she would not go to Los Angeles without her security detail present at all times. Victoria sat at the head of the boardroom table after the others had filed out and stared at the city through the floor-to-ceiling glass. She had a meeting in 4 hours. She had a company to protect. She had a deal that 8 months of carefully constructed silence and pressure and patience had built to the edge of completion, and she was not going to let anonymous threats from cowardly people with listening devices ruin what she had built. She pressed the intercom. "Get Carter in here." Ethan arrived in 3 minutes. He stood on the other side of the table, and she could tell from the stillness in him that he already knew what this conversation was about. Of course he did. He probably knew things about her security situation that she hadn't been briefed on yet, and the thought of that, of being the last to know something about her own life, was almost worse than the rest of it. "Los Angeles," she said. 3 days. You'll travel with me. You'll be present at every meeting." "Understood." "I want to be clear that this is not a preference. The board has made it a condition." "I understand that." She studied him across the table. The pressed jacket, the watchful eyes, the complete absence of any expression that told her he was pleased or smug about the arrangement. "You'll stay at a separate hotel," she said. "You'll receive a daily briefing on my schedule the night before. Any concerns or observations go through my assistant first." Ethan's jaw shifted slightly. "That's not how protective detail works." "It's how mine works." He looked at her for a moment. "If something happens, and I'm at a separate location, then you do your job and get there quickly." She picked up her phone, signaling the conversation was over. "We leave Thursday morning, 6 a.m. He didn't argue. He nodded once, the way someone nods when they've decided to let a bad decision belong entirely to the person who made it, and he walked out. Victoria watched the door close behind him. Outside, 42 floors below Manhattan, moved without her taxis and foot traffic, and the particular hum of a city that didn't slow down for anyone, not even for the people who thought they ran it. She had no intention of letting this arrangement become anything more than what it was: a condition, an inconvenience, a man in a worn jacket standing between her and a problem she intended to solve herself. She opened her laptop and went back to work. Los Angeles arrived with flat white light and warm air that smelled nothing like New York. Victoria's team had booked the entire top floor of a hotel in Century City, 6 rooms for staff, 1 suite for her. Ethan was at a separate hotel 3 blocks east, a smaller place with no valet, and a direct line of sight to the main entrance of her building, which he had noted in his preliminary location report, and which she had not approved but had not overruled either. He showed up at her suite door at 5:58 the first morning, 2 minutes before her scheduled briefing, in the same dark jacket he'd worn on the plane. She was already dressed. He ran through the day's routes, the venues, the names of Hargrove's people who would be in the room, and the 2 locations he'd flagged as security concerns, based on the building layouts her assistant had sent him the night before. Victoria listened, made 2 corrections to the schedule, and moved toward the elevator. "You should have told me about the building on Wilshire," she said on the way down. "I would have had them switch venues." "I handled it. I spoke with their facilities team yesterday. They're putting additional staff on the south entrance." She looked at him sideways. "You contacted Hargrove's facilities team?" "Their building manager, yes." "Without telling me. I told your assistant." He watched the elevator doors. "You were in a call." The precision of it, the chain of it, the quiet efficiency was something she didn't have a ready response for. So she said nothing, which was unusual enough that she noticed it herself. The Los Angeles meetings went well. They always did when Victoria was in the room, because she had a particular talent for making other people feel that agreeing with her was their own idea. The Hargrove team was cautious, but not hostile. The deal was close. 3 days of careful, controlled conversation, and she could feel the finish line in the temperature of the room. What she felt less clearly because she wasn't looking for it was the way Ethan moved through each venue before she arrived. Speaking with staff, checking stairwells, positioning himself at angles she would have called paranoid if she'd been paying attention. At a dinner in West Hollywood on the second night, a man approached her table twice in 20 minutes without ordering anything from the bar he'd been standing near. The second time, Ethan stepped into the man's path with the kind of body language that required no translation, and the man left without ever reaching her. Victoria learned about this the same way she'd learned about most of what Ethan did, which was to say she didn't learn about it at all. What she did notice every evening at 7 was the 4-minute phone call. He always stepped to the window or the far end of whatever hallway they were standing in. His voice dropped to something she couldn't hear clearly, and his posture changed shoulders down the constant vigilance in his eyes, replaced by something that had no professional application whatsoever. Once in the corridor outside a conference room at the Hargrove offices, she caught 3 words. "Did you eat?" The kind of question that meant something different when it was the most important thing you had to ask someone. "You talk to her every night," Victoria said on the last evening in the town car on the way back to the hotel. It came out more observational than she intended. "I do." Ethan kept his eyes on the street outside. "What do you tell her?" He took a moment before answering. "That I'll be home soon. That I'm working. That she should eat her dinner and not give Mrs. Paulson a hard time about homework." Victoria looked out her own window. "And she believes you? She's 8. She believes what she needs to believe." He said it flatly without sentiment, but there was something underneath it that she recognized without being able to name the weight of being someone's entire world and knowing you couldn't make that weightless just by wanting to. She didn't ask anything else. The car moved through Century City traffic, and Victoria sat with her hands in her lap and said nothing for the rest of the drive. The charity gala in Malibu was 3 days after they returned from Los Angeles, a clifftop estate, the same one from the first night, different cause, same crowd, the kind of event where the ocean view existed primarily to give wealthy people something to gesture toward while talking about themselves. Victoria wore black. She moved through the room the way she always did, fluid and deliberate, collecting the conversations that mattered and discarding the ones that didn't. Ethan stood near the entrance to the main terrace, monitoring the room with his usual unhurried thoroughness. At some point in the evening, she drifted close enough to a group near the terrace railing that Ethan was visible from where she stood. His back to the wall jacket slightly too casual for the room eyes moving in that slow, methodical sweep she had come to recognize without meaning to. The woman beside her, a gallery owner named Renee, followed her gaze. "Is that your security?" "It is," Victoria said. Renee tilted her champagne glass slightly. "He looks like he takes the work seriously." "He takes everything seriously." Victoria kept her voice light-carrying. "Including the dress code, apparently. I keep waiting for him to upgrade from that jacket. I think he's committed to the look." A few people nearby smiled. Ethan gave no indication he had heard. He went back to watching the door. At 9:47, the lights on the east side of the estate went out. Not a flicker. Not a surge. A clean cut like a wire pulled. Ethan was moving before the first voice in the crowd registered confusion. He crossed the room in 8 seconds, put his hand on Victoria's arm, firm, not rough, and said, "We're leaving. Right now." "What now?" He pulled her toward the service corridor at the back of the catering area, the one he had identified on arrival as the secondary egress. Behind them, a sound she would later describe to the FBI as like a cabinet falling turned out to be a gunshot hitting the stone pillar beside the terrace entrance. Then another. The crowd fractured into screaming bodies pushing in every direction. Ethan moved her through the service corridor and out through the kitchen loading dock, his hand never leaving her arm, his body always half a step ahead of hers and half a step between her and everything behind them. They came out into the estate's service lot, where a second car, not her regular town car, but a dark sedan Ethan had apparently positioned there without telling anyone, was already running. Victoria got in. Ethan got in behind her, pulled the door, and had his phone to his ear before the car cleared the service gate. She sat in the dark back seat and listened to him relay information, location, number of shots, heard last known position of the shooter, to someone on the other end, who asked questions and received answers and did not express surprise. She realized listening to him that he had contacts she didn't know about and protocols she hadn't authorized, and that both of these things had just kept her alive. "Who was that?" she asked when he lowered the phone. "FBI field office. Agent I've worked with before." "You have a contact at the FBI?" "Yes." "Since when?" Ethan looked at her directly. "Since before the listening device in your town car, which I found on day 2, and have been using to trace the signal source for the past 3 weeks. The car was very quiet for a moment. "You found a listening device," Victoria said carefully, "on day 2. "Yes." "And didn't tell me." "I told you when I had something actionable." He held her gaze. "Telling a client about a threat they can't do anything about creates variables I can't control. You would have pulled the car, changed your schedule, and whoever placed the device would have known we found it and adjusted." She wanted to argue. The argument she had prepared about transparency, about the fact that it was her car and her life and her right to know, dissolved somewhere between her throat and her mouth because the logic was clean and she knew it, and she hated that she knew it. "What did you find?" she said instead. "The signal traces to a vendor account associated with a company called Meridian Consulting. Meridian has 3 clients with verifiable connections to Sterling Tech's board." He turned to face the windshield. "I'm down to 1 name. I'll have confirmation in 48 hours. Victoria sat back. Outside, the Pacific Coast Highway moved past in the dark, the ocean invisible beyond the guardrail, just black water and the sound of it. She had built a company on knowing more than everyone else in the room. She had believed sincerely and completely that information and money were the same thing, that if you had enough of one, you controlled the other, and that controlling both meant you were safe. She thought about the loading dock, the running car, the 4-minute phone calls. She didn't say anything else for the rest of the drive. She met Lily 2 days later by accident. Ethan had left his phone on Victoria's conference room table during a security sweep of the floor, and when her assistant brought it back to the lobby, a small girl with dark eyes and a gap in her front teeth was standing next to him holding a paper bag. School was closed for a district in-service day, he explained, and Mrs. Paulson, the woman who usually watched Lily, had a standing medical appointment she couldn't move. Victoria appeared in the lobby on her way to a downstairs meeting and stopped. The girl looked up at her with the frank, uncalibrated attention that only children and people with nothing to prove could manage. "Are you the lady my dad works for?" "I am," Victoria said. "He says you're very demanding." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "Does he?" Victoria said. "He also says that's okay because most people who run things are." The girl tilted her head. "He says it's harder to run things than people think." Victoria looked at Ethan, who was looking at a point somewhere above the lobby elevator, with the expression of a man who had decided to wait out a weather event. She looked back at the girl. 8 years old. Dark jacket too big for her, likely pulled from a lost and found. Hair pulled into a ponytail by someone who had done it quickly and practically, and with no complaints about it not being perfect. "What's in the bag?" Victoria asked. "Sandwich. Dad forgets to eat when he's working." The girl held the bag up, slightly matter-of-fact. "So I bring it." "Does he forget other things too?" Lily considered this seriously. "He forgets to sleep, and he forgets to take his phone off silent, which is annoying." She glanced at her father. "And he forgets that Dr. Hartley said I need to take the new medication with food, not after." The girl said it the way children say things that are simply part of the landscape of their lives, without drama, without asking for anything. Victoria's meeting started in 4 minutes. She had 7 people waiting downstairs, a room booked, and a presentation her team had spent 3 days preparing. "Tell your father," she said, "that the lobby cafe has better sandwiches." She walked to the elevator. Lily watched her go with those dark, unreadable eyes, and Ethan watched Victoria, and neither of them said anything until the elevator doors closed. The story ran on a Thursday. Sterling Tech Heiress and Bodyguard. More than professional. The headline was exactly as blunt and as hollow as it needed to be to get clicks. The photos were from the Malibu evacuation, Ethan's hand on her arm, their faces close in the darkness of the service corridor, the body language that looked to anyone who hadn't been there like something other than what it was. Her board called that same morning. The conversation lasted 22 minutes and concluded with a suggestion that carried the weight of an instruction. The current security arrangement was creating a perception problem. Given the sensitivity of the Hargrove deal's final stage, given the media attention, given the optics of a young, unmarried CEO appearing to have an intimate relationship with a working-class employee, perhaps a different firm. "I'll take it under advisement," Victoria said, and ended the call. She sat at her desk and stared at the headline on her laptop screen. The photo, the way it looked, the way none of it meant what anyone looking at it would decide it meant, and also the way she was no longer entirely certain what it meant herself. She had begun to trust him. That was the problem, or at least the beginning of one. Trust was not something she gave. It was something people earned over long enough time with enough consistent evidence. And even then, she kept it provisional, kept a hand near the exit. But Ethan had been right about the device. He had been right about the man at the West Hollywood dinner. He had been right about the service corridor in Malibu, the secondary car, the field contact, the 48 hours. He had been right about everything she'd dismissed as excessive or unnecessary or beneath her concern. And her board wanted her to fire him 3 days before the most important signing of her professional life. She closed the laptop and called her attorney. She didn't fire him. She didn't call him in and explain herself either. She moved through the next 2 days in a kind of pressurized silence, taking her board's calls and returning them with calibrated non-answers, while Ethan ran his 48-hour trace to its conclusion. He came to her office on a Friday afternoon and put a single printed document on her desk. "Marcus Webb," he said. "Senior board member. He has a 22% equity stake in a Hargrove competitor. If the acquisition closes, his position loses roughly $300 million in market value." Victoria looked at the document. Marcus Webb. 14 years on her board. A man who had delivered her father's eulogy at the memorial service and had told Victoria afterward that the company was in good hands. "He's been feeding information to a private security contractor," Ethan continued. "The contractor ran the surveillance on your car, placed the device, coordinated the approach in West Hollywood. The shooter in Malibu was freelance, brought in through a third party 2 degrees removed from Webb to maintain distance. You have evidence of all of this, enough for the FBI to move forward. They've been building parallel to my investigation for the past 3 weeks." He nodded at the document. "They want to time the arrest to the signing. Webb is expected to attend. They'll take him in the building." Victoria set the document down. $300 million. $300 million in 14 years of sitting across a table from her, asking about quarterly projections, and looking at her with something she had always read as respect. "I want to be in the room when it happens," she said. "That's not. I want to be in the room." Her voice was flat, certain. "Make it work." Ethan looked at her for a moment, the way he looked at most things she said, that landed slightly differently than she intended, and then nodded. "We leave Monday morning," he said. 6 a.m. They were 12 minutes from the Hargrove offices when the first car came. It hit the lead vehicle from the right side, sharp and deliberate. Not a traffic accident, not a distracted driver. The convoy pulled hard left, and the second vehicle clipped the curb and stalled. Victoria felt the impact through the seat beneath her. Ethan already had his door open. "Stay in the car," he said. He didn't wait to see if she listened. 2 men were out of the blocking vehicle. Ethan reached the first before the man's hand came fully up, and what happened next was fast and brutal, and nothing like the movies. The second man had something in his jacket, and he drew it, and Ethan turned. The sound was smaller than she expected. He was on the ground, not moving the way someone moves when they've fallen, moving the way something moves when the thing that was holding it up has been removed. Victoria was out of the car before she knew she'd made the decision. She was on the asphalt beside him, with her hand pressing against his side, her $4,000 coat soaking dark, and she was saying his name. Not Carter, not the bodyguard, not any of the distances she had built and maintained and polished. She was saying Ethan in a voice she didn't recognize, raw and small, the voice of someone who had just understood, in the bluntest possible terms, the difference between a condition and a choice. The siren started somewhere in the distance. She kept her hands pressed to his side and did not move. The hospital was called Cedars-Sinai, and Victoria had been to its administrative offices twice before, once for a gala, once to announce a corporate donation. She had never sat in a surgical waiting room. She had not known until that night that waiting rooms had a particular sound, a low institutional hum that pressed on you from every direction and gave you nothing to push back against. She sat in a chair against the wall with dried blood on her coat and her phone in her lap and did not make calls. Her assistant had called 4 times. 2 board members had called. Her attorney had called twice. She looked at their names on the screen and could not make herself press anything. A nurse came out at 1 in the morning and used words like stable and clean exit and blood loss in a combination that meant he was not going to die. Victoria sat with that information for a long time before it settled into something she could hold without her hands shaking. Lily arrived 40 minutes later, brought by Mrs. Paulson, the small woman in her 60s, who had been watching Lily since before Victoria had ever entered the picture. She walked into the waiting room with the capable look of someone who had managed a great deal of other people's emergencies, and she put her hand briefly on Victoria's shoulder before she said anything, which was either intuition or the kind of grace that came from watching people long enough to know when they needed it. The girl walked in behind her and looked immediately at Victoria. "He's stable," Victoria said. "He's out of surgery. They say he'll be okay." Lily sat down in the chair beside her, not across the room, not beside Mrs. Paulson. Next to Victoria, close enough that their arms nearly touched. She didn't say anything for a while. "Then, he told me once that the most dangerous part of his job wasn't the situation. It was the second when you stop paying attention." Victoria looked at her. "What did you say?" "I told him to always pay attention." The girl's voice was steady in the way that children's voices are steady when they've already cried somewhere private and are not going to do it again in front of a stranger. "I think he did, because he's okay." Victoria looked down at her hands, still dark at the edges. She should have changed. She hadn't thought of it. "He does pay attention," she said. "He's very good at his job." "He's good at everything," Lily said with the simple authority of someone stating a fact they've never had reason to question. Victoria didn't disagree. By morning, the news had reached the shape that bad news always reaches when it involves money and public figures wide fast and only partially accurate. The convoy ambush was public. Ethan's condition was reported with the wrong details, then corrected, then reported wrongly again. Sterling Tech's stock opened down 4%. 3 major financial outlets ran variations of the same story: Sterling deal in jeopardy, as CEO targeted in organized attack. Marcus Webb called her at 7:45. "Victoria." His voice carried exactly the right amount of concern. 14 years of board meetings had given him a very practiced concern. "I heard about last night. Are you safe?" "I'm fine," she said. "Thank you for calling, Marcus. The signing I assume we'll need to postpone. I haven't decided yet." There was a shift in the silence on his end, brief and small, the kind of adjustment that required knowing what to listen for. "The board's position would be that your safety has to come first. No deal is worth. I'll have my office send the updated schedule," she said. "I hope to see you there." She ended the call and set the phone face down on the hospital cafeteria table. The coffee in front of her had gone cold. Through the window, Los Angeles was waking up in its flat, bright, unconcerned way. Traffic already thick on the boulevard below palm trees, perfectly still, in windless morning air. She had a company in crisis, a board member who had tried to have her killed, a deal worth $4.2 billion hanging on the next few hours, and a man 2 floors above her who had taken a bullet, meant to make all of those things irrelevant. She drank the cold coffee and started making calls. The Hargrove signing took place in a private conference suite on the 31st floor of a building in downtown Los Angeles, with 14 people in the room and 3 FBI agents in the building's lobby, 2 in the hallway and 1 standing near the catering table inside the suite, who had been introduced to the Hargrove team as Victoria's new communications director. Marcus Webb arrived at 10:58, 2 minutes before the scheduled start. He wore a navy suit and carried a leather portfolio and smiled at Victoria with 14 years of practiced warmth when she extended her hand. "I'm glad you're safe," he said. "Thank you for coming, Marcus." The documents were already on the table. The room settled. Victoria moved through the formalities with the same precision she brought to everything, clear, unhurried, in complete command of the room. She signed where the attorneys indicated. The Hargrove CEO signed across from her. The witness signatures followed in sequence. At 11:22, as the room was still processing the completed agreement, the FBI agents from the hallway entered through the main door. Webb understood what was happening before anyone spoke. Victoria watched his face move through recognition. In real time, the small, rapid recalculation that happened behind his eyes, when a man understood that the thing he had spent months constructing had been built on a floor that someone else had removed while he wasn't looking. The lead agent used his full legal name, Marcus Allen Webb. The charges were read in the particular flat cadence of formal law enforcement language: conspiracy to commit murder, criminal solicitation, corporate espionage, wire fraud. The room held its collective breath. Webb looked at Victoria across the table. She held his gaze and said nothing. There was nothing to say that the moment wasn't already saying more precisely. He was walked out through the main door, and the room exhaled, and someone at the end of the table said something quiet to their attorney, and Victoria picked up the signed agreement and handed it to her counsel and said, "Have the press release ready for 2 o'clock." The shareholder meeting was scheduled for 4 that afternoon, moved from New York to a live video format that her communications team assembled in 6 hours. 214 shareholders, 3 financial journalists, and a moderator who had been briefed on the day's events and had the good professional judgment to follow Victoria's lead. She had written the statement herself in the hospital cafeteria at 4 in the morning, and she read it without notes. She told them about Marcus Webb and Diane Mercer Webb's co-conspirator, and Sterling Tech's chief operations officer, who had resigned by email at 2 in the morning and was already in conversation with the U.S. Attorney's Office. She told them about the listening device in the town car, the surveillance, the attack on the convoy. She told them precisely, and without embellishment, what Ethan Carter had found and tracked and documented, and what his investigation had made possible. She told them that her security detail had identified the threat to the company, while she had been focused on the target of that threat, and that this distinction between looking at the problem and seeing the whole board was one she intended to hold on to. She told them she had been wrong about what it meant to trust people, that she had confused distrust with intelligence and contempt with discernment, and that these were not the same things, and that she had been reminded of the difference in a way she did not intend to forget. She did not perform remorse. She stated fact. The shareholders who had known her for years recognized the difference, and the ones who hadn't could look at her face and understand that she was not reading from a script someone else had written. After the meeting, her attorney told her it had gone well. "I know," she said. "The stock will recover by end of week." "I know that, too." She was already thinking about the hospital. Ethan woke on the second day. Victoria was in the chair beside his bed, not standing near the door, not reviewing documents on her phone. Just sitting the way someone sits when they've run out of things to do and have stopped pretending otherwise. She had come back after the shareholder meeting, told herself it was because her attorney needed a signature delivered in person and hadn't left. He opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling, then at her. "The signing," he said. His voice came out rough. "Closed. Monday morning, 11:22. She leaned forward slightly. Webb was arrested in the room. The FBI walked him out through the main door in front of the entire Hargrove team. He absorbed this. Diane Mercer. Resigned at 2 in the morning. She's already in conversation with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Victoria set her phone on the side table. "You flagged the shell company in the back pages of the document. I found it at 4 in the morning while you were in surgery. I wasn't sure you'd read that far." "I read everything." He looked at her for a long moment. The monitors beside him kept their steady rhythm. "Lily," he said. "She's here. She went home with Mrs. Paulson an hour ago to sleep in an actual bed." Victoria reached for the water glass and placed it within reach. "She'll be back in the morning. She was here all night." "She didn't want to leave." Victoria's voice was even. "I told her you'd paid attention. She said she knew." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, something in his face had shifted, not the expression of a man calculating a situation, but of one who had decided something and was no longer in any hurry. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once and looked toward the window. The city outside was doing what cities did, moving without waiting, bright and indifferent and ongoing. "Rest," she said. "I'll be here." Lily's treatment was something Victoria arranged without asking permission, and she acknowledged this to Ethan directly, the way she acknowledged most things she knew he would push back on, by presenting the information before the argument could form. She told him in the parking lot of the hospital 2 weeks after his discharge. The specialist she had retained was the best in the country for Lily's specific condition. The program ran 18 months. The hospital's patient coordinator had already been briefed. Everything was in place. Ethan stood by his truck, a newer model, the previous one having declined beyond repair during his recovery, and listened with his arms crossed and his eyes on the ground. "Victoria, this is not a gesture." She kept her tone even. "I spent 2 months treating you like something I'd hired to stand near a door. I made comments about your jacket in front of people you didn't know, at events you were there to protect me at, and you said nothing and did your job anyway." She held his gaze. "I can't undo that, but I can do this." The afternoon light was flat and warm. Ethan looked at her with an expression she had come to recognize over the past months, not softness exactly, something that had decided where it stood. "Thank you," he said. She nodded and looked away toward the street because she wasn't entirely sure what her face was doing, and she'd spent a lifetime not letting people see that. 4 months later, the Hargrove acquisition had closed, integrated, and begun performing ahead of projections. Webb's trial date was set for the following spring. Sterling Tech's stock had recovered and then exceeded its previous high. Victoria had restructured the board, replaced 3 members, and promoted 2 people from inside the company who had been qualified for advancement for years and whom she had not previously considered because she had been. She now understood. Looking at the room, the way she'd always looked at rooms, scanning for threats to herself rather than potential in anyone else. She had also, in the months since Los Angeles, developed the habit of occasionally eating dinner with people rather than beside them. The restaurant in Malibu was not the Clifftop Estate. It was a small place 2 miles down the coast, the kind of building that looked like it had always been there and had no intention of changing. The tables on the patio faced the water. The lights were low, and the ocean was audible, and the menu was the kind of menu that fit on 1 page and didn't need to apologize for it. Lily sat across from her and worked through an order of fish tacos with the focused satisfaction of someone for whom good food was still the uncomplicated pleasure it was supposed to be. Her color was better than it had been 4 months ago. The specialist called it a strong response. Lily called it finally not feeling tired all the time, which was as descriptions went more accurate. "Dad says you used to make fun of his jacket," she said not accusatorially, just checking the record. Victoria looked at Ethan, who had developed the specific expression of a man who had stopped trying to prevent his daughter from saying whatever she was going to say. "I did," Victoria said. "That was mean." It was. Lily considered this with the judicial seriousness of an 8-year-old who had reached a verdict. "You seem different now." "I am different now." "Because of what happened." Victoria reached for her water glass and looked out at the water, dark and very wide, the kind of view that made the things you thought were large feel appropriately sized. "Because of several things," she said. "Some of them happened. Some of them I had to decide." Lily seemed to find this acceptable. She went back to her fish tacos. Ethan said nothing, but she could feel him not saying it the way you feel, the specific weight of a silence that is full rather than empty. He was watching the water the way he watched rooms, not with suspicion for once, but with the attention of someone who had decided something in front of him was worth the effort of seeing clearly. The ocean made its sound. The lights from the patio caught the edge of the tide coming in. Victoria sat with the people at her table and did not check her phone, and did not think about the next meeting or the next quarter or the next version of herself she was supposed to be assembling. She thought about a paper bag brought to a lobby, about 4 minutes on a phone every evening, about a door in a service corridor, and the sound of someone running toward the thing everyone else ran from. She thought about what it cost to do that, and what it meant that someone had, and what she intended to do with the fact that she knew the difference now. The tide came in. The table stayed warm. Nobody left.